Just to give you an idea of how this session is going to run, we have a panel here who are all people who've got a lot of experience as impact assessment practitioners, but also with designing and implementing biodiversity offsets. So they've all got perspectives to offer. I will let them introduce themselves and explain their background and experience in these areas. But what we're going to do is run through, as seems to be the pattern with this conference, very quick presentations of 5 minutes from everybody. And the reason we're going to do that is because a couple of people here have been involved recently in discussions and sessions that professionals have been having around the world about this topic. So, and in various fora. So Derek here is going to talk about work that the International Association for Impact Assessment has been doing. And John Pilgrim has been involved in some IUCN work on technical advice on offsets and how they fit into the mitigation hierarchy. And I'm based here in the UK, and I'm a member of the of SIEM, which is a professional organisation for ecologists in the UK, and we've had similar discussions recently about building capacity to do offsetting well. So that SIEM conference was held recently in the UK. The IAIA discussions were held at the annual conference of that organisation in Chile. Biotope has held webinars on this subject, and the IUCN work is ongoing. And so we're just trying to draw on some of the things that have emerged from those discussions, and then finish with some more practical discussions about people's experiences as consultants. So some of the questions that we're hoping will then come up in discussion afterwards are to do with what challenges we face as practitioners. How do we go about integrating biodiversity concerns with others? For example, dealing with ecosystem services assessment and making sure that we have good relationships with social practitioners to do that, or human rights experts to do that. What things constrain us in terms of effective integration? Is it to do with money? Is it to do with confidentiality restrictions that would mean we can't talk openly about biodiversity concerns until too late in the process? Or what is it that we need to make things work better? Have standards really changed practice on the ground, or is it still too early to say? And do we have what we need to do the job well? And there was some of this discussion earlier today, this morning, which concluded that maybe tools are the least of our worries, and there are lots of other things we need more. So just to cram in some feedback from the SIEM meeting, and there are people in this room who are there who may completely disagree with what I've picked out as being the key findings. There was a little bit of confusion in that meeting around the mitigation hierarchy, particularly about offsetting rules, so how you might establish rules that control how offsets are used as part of the mitigation hierarchy. There was a feeling that emerged that, yes, avoidance is very important, but if you don't think about offsetting early and make sure it's in your consciousness during the early stages, you might end up being too late to design a good one or not budget for it. So there are lots of practicalities around delivering a good offset which have to do with very early planning. And if you conceptually think of it as the last step in a long process, you're going to be coming to the table too late with your offset proposals. We also had some discussion about the need for assurance and accreditation of professionals. So in the absence of a regulated system, one tends to have to fall back on standards as a means of making sure things are done right. So who would operate that standard? Would it be a global standard? Do we need national or sectoral standards, and so on? So I think it's a bit early to say at this point. So we don't really always know, outside of the PS6 arena, we might not know what standards we're meant to be working to. That's where possibly the Bebop standard could come in. Everyone agrees about land use planning. The reality is in the UK that our land use planning system has just changed a great deal. So some of the same philosophy applies as had done for the last several years, but there's a different emphasis. More of a demand for landscape or regional level planning for biodiversity, and perhaps more of a local focus for how to do that. So it's a bottom-up philosophy in the planning system with a top-down objective. So that's quite tricky as practitioners to handle that kind of dichotomy. People very much feel they get the theory of the mitigation hierarchy and offsets. They do what they can do for their clients, but often suggesting things that might be very difficult to implement if there's no funding stream identified. So might need advice on that. And also possibly the fact that standards can actually help level the playing field a little bit and make life easier for everybody. That's probably more of a personal view. I've just snuck in there. So those of you in the audience who were at the SIAM conference, are there any other things you feel emerged during that meeting that you would like to feed back from a UK practitioner perspective? Looking at you, Bob. You're happy? Okay. Neil?
I think one of the kind of overarching kind of messages throughout was that people weren't sure if it was, and this sort of term was bandied around quite a bit, a license to trash, i.e. jump straight to offsetting because it was a quick solution, or if it was a way of mending what was seen as a currently ineffectual planning system and enforcing something that currently wasn't being delivered due to the ongoing biodiversity loss in the UK. And there was quite a divided opinion poll, and I don't think that any answer was reached. It showed it was still very, very current. But it was interesting how the opinion seemed to swing with different examples, and that there wasn't one fixed answer yet, and it was still very much all up for debate.
Yeah, thanks. That's really good feedback, actually. So yeah, it is quite a polarised situation in the UK at the moment. That's partly because the government's thinking about putting a system in place, and people are realising what it means and exploring the implications of it. So it's quite a hot topic for discussion at the moment. Okay, thanks. If there are no more questions right now, we'll do most of our discussion after these quick presentations. So I'll move on to Derek, who's going to talk about the International Association for Impact Assessments' recent discussions.
Yes. Thanks very much, Joe. And hello, everyone. As Joe said, the name's Derek Melton. I'm with Golder Associates. My history is ecologist by training, mainly worked for governments in Africa for 15 years, impact assessment and ecology work, mainly in Africa and South America for about the last 15 years. So there was a session at IAA in Chile, and I'm looking around. Steve was there, and I'm trying to think there might be some other people as well. And the session was actually essentially to no net loss of biodiversity and beyond. It was the same title as this conference, and it was the whole idea was to come up with challenges for impact assessments from practitioners, not only challenges for them, but also challenges that practitioners see that perhaps should be handled by a government or others. So hardly any time, so it's going to be very much a list with no explanation, so it's sort of a read-through, but quite interesting, I think. I haven't really looked at this after yesterday and today, but one can imagine there's going to be a lot of commonalities, or perhaps there'll be something additional. A little bit of a context. There's actually three main points. The first is act early and think regionally. The second were all under the heading of Equator Principles and IFC Performance Standard 6. And then I lumped together the comments from speakers and also from the floor on biodiversity offsetting. It was very much a wind-up session. There was a number of sessions at IAA, but it was focused, as I say, on feeding information for today. There were over 60 attendees. It was a session in parallel with 8 others, so that was quite good going. It was 9 o'clock on the last day. I was just as I was the chair, I was just happy that they turned up. and that we did have other people there. There were panelists from IFC, NGOs, industry and consulting. So the main points then, just 3 slides I think. The act early and think regionally comes in 2 bits. This slide is the first bit, and it's really ahead of individual projects. So the message was, to make progress, we really need more SEER, we need more rapid assessment type tools being used in order to understand the regional context, and that was seen as a challenge actually for governments, banks, other stakeholders. A clear message that private sector cannot take over regional government responsibilities in terms of regional planning for a single project, which does sometimes, sort of things go in that direction. Unsustainable land use practices such as artisanal mining may be little regulated in less developing countries, while individual projects are subject to very detailed biodiversity guidance. That sort of discontinuity doesn't work on a regional scale. Need more effective cumulative effects assessment within EIAs, need more realistic, robust systems for adaptive management within EIAs, biodiversity action plans. That came because some people were finding that things were quite different as they moved ahead in implementation, and you need to be planning for adaptability going forward. Act early, think regionally for individual projects. So once you've actually got in an individual project, a clear message that we really need real analyses of alternatives, including the no project alternative. And I suppose even going ahead of that, some projects shouldn't go ahead. So in other words, you know, this whole thing of being able to put a project in context and choose between a suite of projects and have biodiversity information used to make no-go decisions rather than coming in late and justifying that project is actually a go. The other thing is individual components within the project. One has go, no-go analyses of alternatives, again, that are real as opposed to justification. Baselines need to be more dynamic. I'm just going to read these without going into them because there isn't time. Need to better understand the levels of biodiversity that represent good condition. It's a technical point. This is quite interesting. Is there a way around taxonomy? And so this really is the time challenges to do with taxonomy for individual assessment, particularly with species new to science and species that have uncertain taxonomy or taxonomic groups. So things like putting animals in a blender and using genetics, evolutionary significant units, habitat hectares, what other ways can responsibly be used as instead of getting to the species level. Need more effective SEER. Have I said that before? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, I think I might have jumped between my 2 slides there, if just to confuse everyone, including myself. In terms of equator principles and PF6, the general feeling was that the equator principles and PS6 did provide good incentive for the full use of the mitigation hierarchy. In general, the feeling was that this was being seen as global best practice. One interesting comment was, is it too rigid a system and not necessarily designed really as an overarching biodiversity impact assessment method? So that was a comment coming from the floor. BBOP guidance on offsetting was seen as a main suite of guidance by many at the IIA session. But other initiatives, CSBI, IUCN, were being recognized, and the message was to ensure good sharing of work and essentially integration between those different initiatives. Last slide, specifically to do with offsetting. Essentially need more on-the-ground published case study evaluations, need more cross-fertilization between those that are involved with regulated and non-regulated offsetting experience. A number of people were commenting that really the crucial activities are often non-technical. So this is getting into offset area protection, co-management, and such things were more important than fine-tuning loss gain calculations in terms of having on-the-ground real success. Pros and cons of how far to advance offset planning during the EIA phase. We've heard here at a number of sessions, really start early, but there were discussions in terms of some of the sensitivities, particularly if a project might not get permitted and proceed, of actually getting involved with communities around an offset area and starting that dialogue when in fact that might not be delivered, and the issues and the concerns that such interactions might cause. Better methods needed to demonstrate positive biodiversity outcomes from action-oriented offsets, such as improving management activities in already existing protected areas. And then the last thing, need a clear plan for offset acquisition and funding at the EIA phase. So, apart from missing a couple of points probably by jumping ahead here, I think I missed the regional planning needs to be ecologically based, unsustainable land use practices. We did have one. No, perhaps I didn't miss too many. Oh, the last one here is really an interesting one, the paradox that we are getting more technical information and understanding biodiversity, but at the same time we are seeing more development in protected areas, which a number of people were basically shaking their head at and trying to understand. But others were mentioning the fact that some protected areas might not be in the right place, and so some tweaking for a win-win might be possible in some situations. Thanks.
Thanks, Derek. That's great. So, any questions for Derek? Just quick questions of clarification?
Or people that were there, perhaps Steve, if anything.
Yeah, Steve Edwards from IUCN. Thanks for that, Derek. You can tell audience by the sheer amount of information that Derek put up there that there was a lot of discussion on this at the IAI conference. And so I just want to reiterate that I found a very large appetite to discuss offsetting and a desire to keep having a space for this within IAIA. The other thing that I wanted to re-emphasize what Derek mentioned was the need for more case studies and documentation from theory to practice. And one final space that I think you overlooked, Derek, that I feel is important, is there was a request for more information and thought put into how to do biodiversity offsetting in different realms, particularly marine and aquatic ecosystems. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. I think it seems to be a very universal call coming out actually for more time and space to discuss actual experiences of doing this stuff on the ground. It always seems to be what gets bumped in conference planning and so on, so I'll have to bear that in mind. John Pilgrim is going to talk to us now about what the IUCN has been doing with their technical group on biodiversity offsets.
Hi there. Yeah, I think a few people have mentioned this process already during this meeting. Some of you probably went to Steve's cafe session yesterday. I've been asked to pull out a few points particularly relevant to impact assessment practitioners on the ground. Large group involved, particularly including Kerry and myself as chairs, and Fabien was also involved in this. A number of other people in the room here I see. As you probably know by now, the aim of this overall is to help develop IUCN policy on offsets, to help IUCN guide its members on when offsets are appropriate, how they're appropriate. And this was the technical component, so a set of experts from within the IUCN membership, Kerry and I developed some input papers on the technical and policy side, which have fed into this group's consideration and deliberations to produce a draft technical study paper. I believe anybody who hasn't seen that yet, Steve may have 1 or 2 spare copies available. The process we're in now is to obtain review and inputs from the broader IUCN membership in order to finalise that study paper and feed it into the policy group, which will ultimately develop this high-level IUCN policy. Key areas of agreement in best practice. The high-level principles are going to be unsurprising to anyone who's been involved in Bebop for some time. Mitigation hierarchy, landscape context, some impacts are not offsettable. These are all fairly familiar principles, give or take a few words from the Bebop process. These are essentially Bebop principles, so I'm not going to go over those in detail. Perhaps more interesting for people on the ground, a couple of practical points that there was a lot of agreement on. And these are about balance. In terms of measuring losses and gains, it was felt very strongly that there was a need to balance broad surrogates of biodiversity, the kind of habitat condition metrics that we often see, with specific metrics for biodiversity of highest conservation concern that may not be represented well by those surrogates. An obvious point, but one that doesn't always come into practice. And secondly, that offset metrics need to find a balance between facilitating exchange, allowing a tradable system for biodiversity, but also limiting substitution, so that different kinds of biodiversity can't just be swapped too easily. And then a large number of less clear areas, areas where guidance is still necessary, areas where IUCN or its members might be able to convene people to solve some of these remaining issues. How to design offsets within dynamic landscapes, thinking in two main ways here. Climate change affecting most of the landscapes we work in. How do we design offsets that can cope with future scenarios under climate change? And also cumulative impacts. Where to place offsets in relation to impacts. There's a sort of rule of thumb. Offsets should be near to impact sites, but there's not been a lot of consideration of exactly what that means and how that should be applied. How to determine the additionality of activities, particularly very topical at the moment within existing protected areas. When can an offset within an existing protected area be additional? Averted risk offsets, a lot of controversy over what is the baseline rate of loss when you're looking at averted risk offsets. It's often possible to make the case for a very broad range of background rates of decline. How can we standardize approaches to that? How can we tackle leakage in offset design and implementation? Familiar topic to anyone involved in carbon offsetting. When and for how long do offsets need to be in place? Do they always have to be in place before impacts? And how can we secure long-term outcomes from offsets? Some discussion earlier on the financial aspects of that. And lastly, establishing effective monitoring and evaluation systems. Quétier and I presented yesterday on something we've been doing in Mongolia on monitoring and evaluation for a project aiming at no net loss. But I think there's been very little thinking about that and how, in particular, to do that for less complex projects in a simple and realistic way. That's me.
Great. Any questions for anyone? For John specifically?
Thanks, John Moffat from Canada. Just curious about the motivation for the IUCN taking on this work. So how does the IUCN see this policy guidance meshing with the various international standards that have emerged and domestic policies that are evolving?
If Steve is willing, I'd probably be better off passing that to Steve since he actually does work for IUCN. He can give you a definitive answer.
You don't have to check. Well, the direct institutional drive for this was at the World Conservation Congress in Jeju in 2012. There was a resolution passed by our members and by our council requesting the IUCN Secretariat to develop an institutional policy on biodiversity offsets. And I wasn't there, but I suspect that a lot of the drivers behind that have been the proliferation of the use of biodiversity offsets, or the intent to use biodiversity offsets, both by governments and NGOs and corporates. Of course, governments and NGOs, and many of them are members of IUCN. And so there was a perceived need for IUCN to have some sort of guidance and position on what are biodiversity offsets and what are some of the parameters behind it. And so this is part of that process to develop what will be, as John said, a general policy that while there's no mechanism or governance in place for IUCN members to take on that policy, it'll be there for their consideration.
So yes, I'm wondering about, maybe this is something we can pick up afterwards, but this issue around development in protected areas and whether offsets enable, or somehow having a culture of offsetting being included might enable that to take place more readily, and whether anybody's actually monitoring that in any meaningful way. It's a difficult thing to separate anecdote from reality, isn't it, in that situation? But it's obviously something people are concerned about. So, I'm going to hand over now to Susie Brownlie. Maybe, Susie, when you introduce yourself, you can explain a little bit about the kind of work you do, so people know what your perspective is.
Hi, I'm Susie Brownlie. I'm based in South Africa, and I do a kind of cross-section of work on both impact assessment review, biodiversity mainstreaming within impact assessment process, and also biodiversity offset work. And as well as that, I'm involved in quite a lot of spatial planning, which also is supposed to bring on board biodiversity planning. So it's quite a wide spectrum. Here we go. I'm going to give a very broad, really just to kick off discussion, I guess, for later in this session. We were asked, as panelists, three main questions, namely, what are the kind of key things that come up when we look at integrating offsets within the impact assessment process from the perspective of a practitioner? Then, what about tools, standards, guidance, and training? Are there enough of them? Are they good enough? Then what are the key things that we feel are needed as practitioners? And then I've taken the liberty of also adding a final slide in my lot about what do we need to enable us to work effectively in this arena and address the mitigation hierarchy and offsets effectively. So let me just kick off, and I hope I'm pressing the right arrow. Yes, I am. These are really just my own experiences in practicing within the field. The mitigation hierarchy may be required in law, but it's seldom rigorously applied. And it is applied only if there are big risks or big costs involved in not looking at alternatives. Otherwise, it's kind of business as usual. This is my project. Okay, there are a bit of impacts here. We'll tweak that and minimize that, and here we go. That's it. Time, money, and lack of adequate data are often an enormous constraint. I don't know, I think probably many of you will share the experience of, we're doing an offset, we want your answer in a month, please, and we want your offset designed in the following 2 weeks. And it's the wrong season, and you don't have the time, you can't tap into the expertise you need. So that is really it's a big threat, I think, to the quality of the work we do. And then the other one is, you say to your developer, we need to do X and Y, and they say, no, we can't do that, it won't be financially viable if we do that. And it's like hitting your head against a wall. That's an incredibly problematic situation. The mitigation myth, I think, again, I hope this is something that you'll resonate with. We get don't worry, we'll restore our damage perfectly. And in many cases, particularly in the kind of environments that I find myself working in, restoration is a complete myth. You may be able to get back 10%, but for the rest, it's basically a trashed environment. Then, impact assessment practitioners may know not a lot about biodiversity. In South Africa, we have impact assessment practitioners that come from social backgrounds, forestry backgrounds, water backgrounds, even philosophy backgrounds. And some of them really know very little about biodiversity, they don't understand it, and to expect them to know about offsets, let alone the mitigation hierarchy or vice versa, is a tall ask. And likewise, many biodiversity specialists don't understand the impact assessment process or the mitigation hierarchy. So you have quite a challenge, and we're finding increasingly that we need a biodiversity offset specialist to act as a go-between between the environmental assessment practitioner and the biodiversity specialists and other specialists, because they have that kind of knowledge that will bridge the chasms. The quality of specialist work, we find there too. We might have two different botanists with completely different views on how to do work. And it's quite a challenge to try and find common ground and consistency. I think, this is just a suggestion, it's important to design the impact assessment process around key decision points. So for us, we're increasingly finding, can things be offset? Are they offsettable? And the earlier we know that in the impact assessment process, the better for the entire process. You may want to pull out because the risks are too big. So if we can identify critical decision points in the impact assessment process to answer specific questions, it helps that process. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going a bit slowly here. With regard to tools, standards, guidance, and training, we certainly have a lot of excellent BBOP tools. We've got the BBOP standard, we've got IFC Performance Standard 6, and I won't dwell on any of these because other people have mentioned them. Training is not always readily available unless you can jet across to an international event and get that training, or you can afford to get that training, and it's often extremely costly. The theory is often unattainable in practice. So we need guidance, I think, on prioritizing a good enough outcome. And I think it touches on some of this call for being a bit more pragmatic and a bit more flexible in what we do. If we know where we're trying to get to, we should be allowed to be quite innovative in arriving at that point. We also need to help, we need more help with respect to the implementation and financial provision and management part of offsets. We're getting quite good at designing them, but we really are missing a lot of assistance in particularly when to approach landowners in the process, how to negotiate on and arrive at quantums for financial provision. And then, just lastly, before I go on to the next slide, the issue of equity and environmental justice. You know, we're supposed to be looking at use values and cultural values and looking at the distributional impacts in our work. And I think there are very few of us that actually do that. Then what's needed? Certainly, and Joe, you touched on this, quality assurance, we desperately need in offset practice. Some kind of certification or professional registration for people who do offset work, who validate offset designs, and who verify the implementation and achievement of offsets. I think it would be quite useful to think about a train-the-trainers approach to get more courses going and to build capacity across the spectrum of regulators, practitioners, and specialists. We need guidance, I think, on the key decision points, and that's something I've said already, in a typical process. What answers do we have to answer? What questions do we have to answer at what key decision points in that process? And it's not just the impact assessment process, it's tied in with the engineering team, the planning team, the design team for the project. What questions should we be answering when? And what are the options that it might foreclose in terms of project design? And then needing what to do when type of practical advice. Drawing on actual case studies, we need those desperately. What have we learned from trying different things on the ground? And then finally, No one's holding up a red 1-minute thing yet. These are the enabling factors that I think we need to do our work effectively. This is an ideal case. We need very clear policy on offsets. What is required? We find ourselves often coming up with ideas and we've got no solid, concrete hook to hang it on, and the developer will turn around and say, well, there's no policy, why do we have to do this? We need explicit limits. We need to know where that threshold between offsettable and non-offsettable is. And that is a very local and specific context, but we would love information on that in order to do our work effectively. Having systematic biodiversity plans or spatial biodiversity plans at one's disposal is enormously helpful. We know where the biodiversity priorities are. We know where ideal offset receiving areas could be. It's incredibly handy. Up-to-date, reliable biodiversity data and information, that's a no-brainer. And again, going back to this idea of decision points, what outcomes must be achieved at what stage of that process? Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. So I guess that's a perspective drawn from many, many different projects that Susie's worked on, but it seems like these things come up again and again, so hopefully we'll get on to sorting some solutions in the half hour we have left at the end. So Rowena Smuts is going to, I think, run us through some actual practical experiences. Is that correct?
Surprise.
Yeah, it's a surprise.
There's been a lot of mention of the word biodiversity and much talk and words around biodiversity and very few pictures, so I thought we needed some pictures. And this is a beautiful white-fronted bee eater that successfully managed to catch a butterfly in Botswana. And I thought that's quite appropriate because of all this wonderful theory that's contained in the minds of the participants here. The question is this theory being incorporated into practices and actually implemented on the ground? And I'm going to draw on some project experience undertaken by, from SRK, currently employed based in Cardiff, and pose some questions. So it's less about answering our topics at this point. Just going to fly through. Do I have to do this? So just a quick sales pitch on SRK for those of you who aren't familiar with the company. It's a global organization, and you can basically read this. They focus on servicing the mining sector. Some of the specialist services that they offer, and environmental and social expertise. And then I'm going to go into two little examples that I want you to think about, and perhaps will stimulate some debate during our discussion. So in the first instance, this is a project that was located in an area of high biodiversity. Quite a few areas were classified as critical habitats across the site, and the company, what is the company's approach to biodiversity management at this project site? They recognized the biodiversity represented a risk to the project, and that failure to manage their impacts could result in project schedule delays or company reputational risks. So as a result, early on in the project development, they applied the mitigation hierarchy, focusing quite strongly on avoiding, and so working very closely with the design engineers to shift infrastructure on the surface where this might impact on unique habitat. And they undertook an extremely comprehensive biodiversity assessment, working very closely with local NGOs in the field. What were some of the constraints to implementing biodiversity offsets in the early stages of project development? And I've sort of tried to dig these out. Firstly, in this instance, the country that they're operating in doesn't have a legal requirement for offsets. It's a junior mining company, and so the company hasn't made a commitment to no net loss as part of their corporate policy. And there wasn't considerable pressure from NGOs to include offset planning in these early stages of project development. and it's unclear also whether the lenders will or won't require a biodiversity offset. But I think what's worth noting is that because the company took the risk seriously, they gathered a lot of information, and at any point when this offset is triggered by either the company itself, the government, or a potential lender, they will be able to start planning this offset because they've got a good idea of what the impact might be. So that's the one example. The other example is a case where a rapid biodiversity assessment was done in the field, and as part of the EIA, there was a recommendation made to gather a lot more biodiversity data to properly characterize the biodiversity on the potential project site, to assess whether it really was critical habitats or not. The government then granted the permit for approval without requiring those additional biodiversity studies to be undertaken. And construction schedule constraints then meant that the land was cleared without those comprehensive biodiversity studies being undertaken, making future characterization of the sites a little bit more tricky because you've now lost the habitat that was there that needed to be assessed, and you'd have to look at adjacent areas, but some of those have also been disturbed. So this is kind of a different example where I think it's worth noting that lenders and government and companies appear to be paying closer attention to resettlement and stakeholder engagement, and recognizing the specific business risks, particularly in respect to short-term schedule constraints. But biodiversity, on the other hand, is not necessarily seen as a direct business risk in the short term, sufficient enough to influence government lenders and the company to prioritize characterizing the potential disturbed areas before construction starts. And so the point I've made here with this funny little LORAC slide is that in some instances the trees don't speak out, especially where there's no active outspoken community or international NGO. So I mean, these are just two project examples. Many mining projects go ahead in areas where there aren't biodiversity concerns, but I think this just shows that the theory is not always put into practice on the ground, as Susie was sort of alluding to, and the factors are complicated. And the conclusion that we've come up with is that you need at least one or preferably three of these conditions to be met for this offset planning to take place at an early stage. So either the company has to have the policy commitment, the country has to require it, or the lender has to make their loan dependent on that offset strategy planning being undertaken and implemented. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rowena. Has anyone got experiences that resonate with that? I certainly do. Does seem that despite everybody actually knowing that front loading of biodiversity work is so important, it still doesn't really happen. I'm not quite sure why that still is. And despite the long lead times you need to do biodiversity work properly. So, any questions for Rowena? Okay, Fabien. Lead us into discussion.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to keep my little moment here short so we can have our plenary discussion. Some of what I'll say I already know now will resonate quite a lot with what has already been presented, so hopefully that'll get the discussion going. The place that I'm speaking from is a specialized consultancy coming from France called Biotope, which was established 20 years ago and has worked on development, of course, but also on conservation, so located at that interface. What's interesting, I think, from our experience, and if you've listened to the French Ministry of Ecology here at the conference, you'll know about this, is that there's been over the last 20 years a very strong strengthening of the way biodiversity is taken into account in the permitting of development projects. So starting from very generic EIAs from 20 years ago to actually now dedicated procedures that deal with specific biodiversity features, some species, some types of habitats, and the fact that these dedicated procedures have come up has given us the opportunity to build a sort of balanced outlook on how to deal with biodiversity in the projects. So I'll just, does this work? I'll just do a very quick recap on a project that I presented yesterday with Brice Quenouille from Bouygues Construction. It was a high-speed railway line in southern France, and we tried to highlight some of the key elements that you need to take into account as a practitioner working with a developer to try and achieve no net loss. Of course, as was said previously, anticipation is really crucial. And it's not just the offset you have to anticipate. I mean, it's not just the classical avoidance and reduction you have to anticipate, but also the offset component of that. Working early on, I think, to trial solutions, both from a technical point of view, but also from an acceptability point of view, and ensuring that you have people there backing you on what you might then propose. And that means you have to engage with stakeholders on those issues also early on. Another key change, I guess, from having a no net loss perspective on these projects is the fact that you're introducing measurable performance goals. And this is, I think, really one of the key elements of the discussion we're having here in comparison to other fora. So of course you need to build your loss gain calculation tools and create the metrics that you're going to use to design your offsets. But again here, if you want that to work, it's not something you have to do in your ivory tower and build only on the basis of theory and scientific knowledge. You have to make sure that people are able to understand how you're building your case and why you're making these choices and these decisions. There's decisions on the metrics, the indicators. There's also decisions on why you're giving priority to this feature rather than this other feature. And these are not so easy to ground in science. You have to engage again here with stakeholders to make sure that people are happy with those decisions. So again, a key point is to make sure that you're engaging with the right people at the right time for this. And then another, I think, related point with having a performance approach to this is that once you've set out clear goals and you've gotten the right people around the table to share those goals, then you're sort of freed from a too strong focus on showing goodwill and showing that you're putting the right means, financial or otherwise, for dealing with the problem. And you can be more imaginative in terms of the various actions that you can sort of propose and implement to reach the goals. And one of the main outcomes from this particular project was that we had a whole catalog of offset alternatives that we could then propose to people on the ground so that they could decide what they would take up, how they could shift it, how they could locate it. And we were introducing flexibility in the system to make sure that, in a way, the same sort of complex negotiation you might have on avoidance, you were having it here on the offsets and making sure that you were doing the right thing in the right place to achieve your performance goals. So the main conclusion from that experience that I presented with Brice yesterday was the stakeholder engagement in getting this to work. It's not just a theoretical scientific exercise. It's really grounded in working at the interface between the project and a wide range of stakeholders. And Biotope's expertise in that field, I think, is sort of shows the importance of having people who can work as brokers, if you like, brokers of knowledge between the developers and people who show concern for biodiversity, of course, but also regulators. And I mainly come from a compliance context, so this is really important in my daily work. But that doesn't mean it's not because you're in a regulatory environment with hundreds of pages of guidance and policies that you don't have to be creative in finding solutions and making sure that they're adapted to the local context and being very pragmatic about that. And I think I'd really like to insist on really being careful about what you're promising. And the restoration myth is very important to keep in mind at all times. And because you're being pragmatic, but you have you still have these performance goals, that gives, I think, and this is what I've seen in the past years, a much stronger or a much stronger need for thinking through how you're going to measure that performance. And so this is something you have to do afterwards, of course, for monitoring results and auditing that things are working out. And I sort of get tired of people putting so much effort in the design phase of the offset. You build these metrics, you design these complex loss-gain calculations, and in the end, you negotiate a monitoring protocol which has nothing to do with what you've designed. And so, in fact, you'll never be able to learn from that experience and be able to prove that the decisions that you made actually made sense and are going to enable you to achieve your performance goals. And to go back to the metrics, of course, you need to be explicit about the choices that you make at that level. And the last point on what this no net loss perspective is bringing about in this progressive evolution of the way we're doing this in this role that we have is that because you're being so focused on performance on the offset side and having all of these discussions, then that then sort of trickles back up, in fact, on the earlier stages of the mitigation hierarchy. And my concluding point would be that our discussions on offsets and no net loss are very much grounded in taking into account all of the hierarchy and being really paying attention to the context in which you want to make sure that a development project is fitting in nicely. And that's it.
Thanks, everyone. So we've got half an hour, more or less. Coffee in 15 minutes. It says 3:30 on. Oh well. Okay, programs can change without my knowledge. That's fine. So we don't have very long for discussion, but we do have some time. Floor is yours. There are a few things we could focus on. I think the challenges of integration are interesting, whether it's cross-specialisms or within the time frames and challenges of finance or project design or getting everything done before a design freeze. And all that's definitely a challenge that we all face. But I also wondered about this question of early definition of non-offsetability and whether people have had experience with that and what they've done in order to expedite an early understanding of whether impacts are likely to be offsettable or not because they're under time pressure, how they've approached it. How many people in this room have actually been involved in designing or implementing an offset? Wow, so it's a lot of people. So why do you think these practical experiences aren't getting out there? Does anyone have theories about why we've got this common call coming out for why don't we hear more about practical experiences? Is it confidentiality issues largely? Yeah, okay.
But if I may, when do usually things are in the public domain if an EIA goes through? So is it a case that often it's planning and then projects are getting put on hold? Surely once things are in the actual EIA is approved, the project's approved, and everything's in the public domain.
It's also about the effort of propagation. My name is Quétier from Shell. We often get requests to write case studies or to provide information, and really it distracts us from our key activity. So very simply writing it down and getting it through the internal approval processes is a blocker sometimes. And yes, the EIA is public, but the offset example is somewhere hidden in one of the many chapters. So I think there's more publicly known than is readily accessible.
Okay, thanks.
Pete Lowry from Missouri Botanical Garden. I think in answer to your question, Derek, about why about the confidentiality part, an EIA or any other document that's produced at the end of the process shows the result, but that result was reached through a process of comparison, iteration, negotiation. That part of the process is the part that's confidential, and that in lots of cases people don't want to see the range of options that were considered, some of which may have been more desirable from the point of view of one or another stakeholder. So the end result is not confidential, but the end result is less what we're interested in.
Yeah,
we're talking about a process that gets us from having some information, laying out options, comparing those options and alternatives, and working with a client through the process to come up with a defensible, presumably acceptable proposal for offsetting and moving ahead with it. So the confidentiality applies to the process, not on the final end result.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that takes us to alternatives, and do people here feel that they've been involved in rigorous and early biodiversity inclusive consideration of alternatives? Is that the norm, or is the norm not to be able to have that opportunity? And when it's worked, why has it worked? What's driven it? Is it corporate policy that's driven it, or is it external regulation or lender pressure that's driven it? I'd be curious to know a little bit about that.
I'm John Howe from ArcelorMittal, Liberia. I think just to add one point to his comment, I think a lot of offset programs are looking at a very long-term strategy, and you can't be sure that you're getting to outputs that you really want to share until you're a very long way into it, and until you reach that point where you're really confident of output, you wouldn't want to publish it anyway. But I think thinking about EIAs, an EIA is only ever an approximation, and the problem that you have as a practitioner is trying to convince a client that they've got what they paid for, and that it will give them what they need for the regulator and the investor. But actually, what you've got is not definitive, and it never can be definitive except at a particular point in time when you do the baseline, because you're always looking at a dynamic environment. And therefore, by the time an EIA is published, it's already out of date. Things have already moved on, and people start to become defensive about it because they don't want to start reinvesting in further baselines and so on. But certainly when it comes to running an offset program which has been defined as part of an EIA, you've got to make sure that it's entirely dynamic with the environment. Otherwise, you never really address the issues which are changing constantly. So I think EIAs have serious limitations. They're only a means to an end, and they have to be recognised as that by the regulators as much as by anybody.
Thanks, John. I'm glad you raised that point about dynamic baselines, and I happen to know there might be somebody in the room who might want to pick up on that? No? It's something that was coming up in discussion earlier about definitions of no net loss or net positive, and whether we should be working from a static point in time as defined in an ESA, or should we be actually doing predictive exercises to model forward to support a precautionary definition of no net losses, reflecting a possibly dynamic baseline. And I know this has come up often in projects that people have had to deal with, so if anyone's got experience that they'd like to share about that, that would be welcome. Or anything else you want to?
Martin Zaramowicz from Brandenburg. I have a question and a remark to Fabien's talk. You said that you try to offer stakeholders some flexibility on where to have certain offsets. When I got you right, from my practical experience, it's quite a task to ensure the long-term feasibility and stability of a certain offset on a certain site. So I'm wondering, how do you manage to people offer even several alternatives of realizing an offset? And my remark would be, isn't that a bit of danger that, to cause the illusion during the EIA process that there are a lot of feasible alternatives, but in the end it may come out that you are limited to some very special conditions where it's only possible to ensure the success of the things you want to have?
Well, so it's as was mentioned just before you spoke, it's a dynamic process where you're negotiating an arrangement to get your approval, but if you then have made a commitment to achieving certain goals, you need to make sure that what you've negotiated, you'll be able to implement it. So there's two risks, of course. One, or at least one, of course, is to be too flexible in your design and having the regulator or the investor not trusting you on that and saying they're not offering the right guarantees. But then there's the other risk that if you've completely blocked your arrangement and made a commitment that this is how you're going to do your offset there then with these people, and that they change their mind or they don't agree, then you've got the risk that you'll never be able to implement what you committed to. So you have to sort of navigate that space. Well, of course, there's the legal and the financial setup that are really important for that. And then there's the ecological feasibility element, which is key. And so the example I had in mind when I was saying that and that I presented yesterday was for species that use various types of environment that are compatible with human farming activities, you know, under certain conditions. So you have that space, that ecological space in which you can play around and sort of find the right combination. It doesn't work for all of biodiversity, and of course, typically for some of the rarer, more endangered species with really specific requirements, you probably can't play that game. But you should certainly not give up on trying to be creative and flexible if that then helps actual implementation. And if I may, there was this mention that you know, confidentiality and sort of in the design phase it is a problem for accessing data and publishing data is a problem. But I think we should also discuss making public the actual results of implementation of offsets, not just the design phases and the negotiation ahead of projects.
Okay, thanks. We've got some hands stacking up here. So, gentleman in the middle at the back there, and then you next, and then whoever it was at the back. Yes. So Dave Richards was first.
Thanks very much. Dave Richards, freelance, formerly of Rio Tinto. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Joe. I'm not going to talk about declining baseline because I know that from John's presentation, it is one of the issues which has been flagged for further resolution and discussion during that process, if nothing else. But I am not an EA practitioner, but I'm a geologist. And I think your call for what to do about front-end loading biodiversity information means you need to understand the business processes of the sectors which you're dealing with. And as far as mining is concerned, I think there's one phase you need to hit and target with your message, but everything gets slid together into one long process which mining people do. In fact, you know, if you talk about exploration, I think it's a waste of time. It's a very light footprint, large areas, little infrastructure, little long-term presence there. By the time you mobilize a team of people to look at an area, they say, oh, we forgot about that because the first stream sediment samples were negative, so we got over there. You can't focus enough on it to make it worthwhile. But then once that's actually locating a deposit of some sort, maybe not worth looking at, but if it's interesting enough, then they'll want to sort of delineate an ore body. And there's a phase then which is normally called evaluation, when they establish a presence on the ground, so there'll be some impacts, there'll be accommodation provided, there'll be some logistics, infrastructure, access, communications, they'll produce maps, good quality maps and their photos, set up a GIS system to put their information into. All this is incredibly useful stuff for anyone who wants to plug in a biodiversity survey into that area. And it's already focused enough that you're not going to waste money from the company's point of view in areas which you're then going to relinquish straight away. So you should, I think, be targeting that part of the company's activities. So, I mean, how do you get traction? How do you get access? How do you get your message into that part of business? Because once it's gone on to feasibility, which is probably the next stage, the risks are too high, the investment required is too big, you've missed the opportunity to influence the fundamental design criteria of the deposit, the location of things, areas to be excluded for whatever reason. So I think to get, I mean, I don't know if anyone's looked at the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada developed a tool called Environmental Excellence in Exploration, which they roll out to all their members and there are people outside the organisation as well. And that should contain things like, you know, when you get onto evaluation drilling, you need also to be factoring this sort of stuff into you. And it's a good practice. There are quite a lot of influence as an organisation, it's not just Canada. I think there are a couple of other things. You need to be talking to the mining industries so they can put into the conditions of exploration licenses the need to do this sort of work. Sounds difficult talking to mining ministers. There used to be a global forum of mining ministers which met, still is, on a regular basis. Get onto that agenda. You know, the IUCN needs to be the organisation president, maybe it's CBD. Someone needs to talk to those ministers together. This would really, really help. I've got a couple of other things here if I can read them.
Just one more quick one, and then we're going to move on.
And I guess there's always, when evaluation drilling is expensive, and it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to hold, that sort of thing. So someone's going to fund that. There's a first tranche of funding which goes in. It doesn't all come in one big lot, your tails down where it hits. First tranche of funding, lenders who make that funding could be requiring this to be part of the conditions of their loan. And I'll sign up on that. But you need to really focus on the business process, getting this in there.
Yeah, so critical decision paths and gateways that everyone needs to know. So, gentleman over here was next, I think.
I have a really quick question. I heard, you know, we talk about no net loss or net gains for biodiversity, and then I'm also hearing stuff about good enough and flexible. And so, which is it?
As far as I'm concerned, no net loss is the minimum outcome required for an offset. I think the question is how you specifically design no net loss in any particular context. But I don't know, is there anyone else on the... John Pilgrim, do you want to...
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think George Kelly echoed my thoughts yesterday when he was talking about the experience in the US and how no net loss and net gain are the goals that I think we all want to aim for. But these are challenging to say the least, and these are novel as well, and we don't know all of the answers to how to get there. The work coming out of the IUCN group and others that have been presented today show that there's still an awful lot of questions. So I think we do need to aim for no net loss or net gain. But in the meantime, we are going to have to accept that we're not going to get that with all projects. You set in place an offset design, and until 20 years down the line, you may not know whether you succeed or not and actually achieve net gain. You can design it as well as you like, but you may not get there. So I think in the interim, as we work towards understanding what makes perfect no net loss, we need to accept what is good enough.
This is a real quick follow-up then. Sorry, but are we putting as consultants, do we then put our clients at risk by telling them we're going to produce an offset that achieves net gains when in fact maybe not?
I think there's always a risk when you're dealing with biodiversity. We have imperfect knowledge. I would certainly never guarantee to a client that I would be able to design an offset that would absolutely achieve net gain, except in perhaps the most simplistic scenarios, which are not the ones that we generally deal with. I think you need to be quite honest about that. And I think as a broader community, we do need to foster that learning environment to allow people to make mistakes in the interim, because we simply don't know all the answers.
But sometimes it's about estimating at least the levels of uncertainty or risk that you feel are appropriate, given the recommendations you're able to make. So claims about being able to restore habitats where there's no documented evidence in the literature that anyone's been able to do that before, obviously you're putting your client at risk if you then say that that's perfectly achievable. But if you're upfront about the risk, the limitations, and you factor the research needed in, and the regulator is prepared to accept that, then, you know, it's all about who's scrutinising and what they're requiring in terms of levels of assurance, isn't it?
Yeah, and certainly where there is a bounds of knowledge, to take the precautionary approach on that is clearly the least risk within it.
Okay, Susie just wants to respond to that, and then we'll take another question.
Is this working? Yes, it is. My impression when we spoke about flexibility was more in the methodology and the approach rather than in the outcome. In other words, we're saying the outcome is definitely no net loss, preferably net gain, but there must be flexibility in the methodologies, the approaches, the routes we take to get there. I think that's more the definition or teasing out of the word flexibility.
That's it, and because the other way of framing it is asking or third parties asking your client how much money did he put into compensation or offsets, or what's the land area of offsets, which is typically a very poor measure of a no net loss outcome.
Yeah, sure. So we have a question up at the back, and then two here, and that was probably all we've got time for, but we'll see how we go.
Hi, Steve Eriksson. I'm actually working at the mine company who has just been in the process of making a compensation plan. And in Sweden, where I come from, everything is already in the open, so it's not confidential, because everything that we make, we have to hand over to the legal system. So it's all open for the public to read and see. So you have to choose what you put in your report, of course. But my question to the panel is, I've always thought that one of the benefits with using a quantitative model is the more transparent way to show what you are measuring and if those indicators are going up or down. And it feels a bit surprising that not many companies want to, because it's quite a big investment to actually do a compensation project to see how that compensation is actually working. And also, since we have to, because it's half of our permit, we also have to do the follow-up, and those will also be transparent and able for everyone to see and give credit on, which is something that we have to take. So I was just wondering if not that is something that you have to consider when you're proposing a model.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure that's right. And it depends a lot if you're in a permitted and regulated context or a very unregulated context and you're effectively making your own rules. So, yeah, the self-regulation of the industry is something we might have to get onto. Yeah.
Perhaps just quickly say, I can think of a couple of examples where in a non-regulated situation, industry I was working with are putting a lot of information out immediately. in addition to regulated situations, but obviously that's not always the case, and there's strategic reasons when sometimes that isn't happening.
Okay, thanks. I think the next question was, do you still want to ask your question?
Yeah.
This guy was first.
Okay. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. I was wanting actually to go back to this idea of declining baselines, because there were a couple of case studies in one of the talks I was at yesterday which worried me, because they were talking about offsets which consisted of averted loss, where they were assuming there was going to be deforestation in these areas, and they said, well, if we reduce the amount of deforestation, we can call that a gain. And it just worries me slightly that we get into those situations where we say it's net gain, but what we're really saying is, well, we would have lost 50% of it, we're only going to lose 40%, so we call that a 10% gain. I'm not really sure we should be doing that. I'm just wondering if I can get any comments on that from the panel.
Yeah, Susie, you have views on this, don't you?
You really are putting me on the spot. I think, yeah, this is a really tricky one, and I think it points, for me, and this is a very personal view, it points to the tension between project level no net loss and looking at no net loss at a country level. And I think there is actually a gap and a really strong need to try and align the two, because as you rightly point out, there are ways of calculating and using metrics to come up with a smaller offset because you claim that the background loss is high. And obviously, the rate of background loss will depend on your timescales that you use and various other things. So there is a potential to abuse the metrics in your favor. So I think for me, the more important outcome is what are we trying to achieve for biodiversity at a national level, and how can the project no net loss outcome contribute commensurately with that outcome? So, yeah, I think I'll stop right there.
Yeah. What's the general consensus in the room about averted risk offsets and their legitimacy? So, who's generally sort of comfortable with them as long as you do it right, and who's got big concerns about them? Maybe people don't know.
Yes, one question.
The first question being, people with experience of doing averted risk offsets, so they're generally comfortable with that. Yeah, of course we don't know, it's bad science because I don't know who's done them. Yeah. Does anyone want to respond quickly from the back who's been involved in designing them?
Can I ask something about doing offsets? If that, sorry, but I mean,
not interested. It's got to be related to averted risk offsets. Otherwise, there's a queue.
Hi, me again. Sorry. Yes, to answer your question, and yours as well. I think averted loss is actually quite good, depending on in which context. Is that working anymore? In which context you use it. Because, for example, our authorities want us to, instead of creating new values, actually protect the ones that we already have. And I would also say that that's also depending on what kind of values that you still have in your near area of the place where you are working. I mean, if there is a real danger of an old growth forest, for example, being cut down, and you can save it by buying that forest or something similar, I don't see why that should be a problem, instead of trying to create values that won't be there for 200 years in a forest that have been already cut down.
So it's about not overinflating your predictions in order to cook the books, basically, which we all know we shouldn't ever do. So it's about evidence-based, I guess. Oh, sorry, it's this person is first.
Still
and
on
then
averted.
there's one more. Just
So I think So my question's along sort of these lines really. It's kind of when is an offset or not an offset? Because often, I think your point earlier around the need to look at alternatives early on is valid, it's highly valid and incredibly important. But often, particularly those of us who are working in global partnerships with cement companies, we're coming into a project which, you know, the operation's been going for a number of years, 5, 10, 20, and there might not actually be very good baseline data about the site prior to when those operations began. Indeed, the company might have actually acquired it from another company and so on. So if you're looking to try and have a net gain off-site, but you have very poor data on-site, is it reasonable to call what you're trying to do, be it through an averted loss or other means, an offset if you've got very little or no data about what's been lost in the first place? Because it kind of depends where you set the baseline.
Rowena, that kind of picks up on one of your examples, doesn't it? So what did you do in that case? Did you look at the wider context and extrapolate, or what did you? Yeah. Okay, so there are things you can do. I guess you have to table your assumptions and take a precautionary worst-case position to make it remotely legitimate. But of course, there's always a risk that your particular site might have had uniquely represented things on it that aren't remaining in the surrounding landscape, and so.
Yeah, I mean, it depends how far back you go, I guess, because if you go back 50 years, you might find you could take a reference condition for an open forest, which then you're trying to set the bar very high, but if it was grainy, but in the absence of information, I guess you've got to push high.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably better than doing nothing, but it's one of those things. It's a reality that lots of people face, unfortunately. Any other comments on that one?
Well, I wanted to comment something on the averted loss approach. I mean, my slides and my presentation were all about being sort of pragmatic and adapted to the context, so that's really essential. And sometimes, of course, averted loss makes a lot of sense in a given situation. So that's really something that, you know, you shouldn't self-censor yourself in terms of all of the different options that you can contemplate to try and find the best biodiversity outcome, which would be, as we discussed, you know, at least no net loss. But I wanted to raise a particular point on that, is that the theory of averted loss and the logic of averted loss only works if the impacts of your project are independent, as in statistically independent, from the dynamic of loss against which you're making that calculation. And so as long as it only applies to a few selected projects for whatever reasons, but isn't a requirement across the board, then it makes sense. But you can't impose, I believe, this is a personal opinion, that you can't do averted loss across the board in a region, because then you lose that statistical independence between the loss that's caused by the project and the background loss. And so that's really important, and I think it's a particular challenge when you then try to go from project level no net loss, if you like, to landscape level no net loss, or national level no net loss policies. And the challenge there is I think, as yet unresolved, and probably needs to be worked on.
Okay, I think we're in danger of missing coffee and getting kicked out by the next plenary session, so I feel terrible not letting you. Is it a burning question, and can it be really tiny? Oh, we've got 2 burning questions.
No, I think the plenary is supposed to be in the other room.
Oh, in the other room.
Yeah, so they've started.
Yeah, okay, well, if people feel they have to go, then they'll have to go in 2 seconds. But yeah, please go ahead quickly.
Sorry, no. I was wondering if any one of you had actually worked on the implementation of an offset, because I feel we're talking all the time about measuring, developing, but I haven't heard a single example over the past 2 days of an actually implemented successful offset in a non-OECD country. I mean, we always hear the 2 examples that are still under development, and then talking about what do I tell to the mining minister of Congo tomorrow about what he needs to do, and for that we really need examples of where things work. and not in 20 years, but preferably now, because otherwise we'll never convince them to actually change anything in their policies to facilitate this. So is there anything that can be said about that?
Perhaps just say that there was a presentation on the Biodiversity project, which has been in implementation. Is that the one you mentioned just now, as knowing about that one? And okay,
There are a few in the pipeline actually. So there are lots of people verging on being able to implement some. I've got one I'm very hopeful for, but it's still not there on the ground. So, and there are others that are in the situation that John Howell identified that I know of, which are in place in terms of a commitment, but which it's too early to say whether they've been successful or not. So I don't know if you want to...
Just a brief comment on that. I mean, the reality is that offsets as a concept with that name haven't been around for very long, and the gains you are going to get are small each year. So the reality is that we simply haven't got to the stage where many offsets outside of regulatory environments have been finished. I will highlight a study that we recently did for WCS in Myanmar on some early stage compensation projects by a consortium of oil companies working with the government there on a pipeline project. I believe that's about to be published in a month or two. And that was not intended as an offset at that time. It was intended as compensation. And it certainly, that project doesn't fulfill all of the Bebop principles because they weren't understood and well developed at that time. But I think it represents a pretty good example of a good enough offset. That's one example.
There are obviously a lot in the States that, you know, you can argue about how successful they've been, but there are a lot of examples of restoration offsets, constructional creation offsets, and there is that experience, and from other countries as well, but unfortunately, I think you'll have to maybe do this offline. Last question, Jan. No, she doesn't need to ask it anymore. So thanks very much for your time, and see you later.